Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In previous lectures, we've talked about popular culture and television and movies in the 1960s, and in this lecture, we're going to pick up the thread and talk about one of the more controversial elements of culture in the 1960s, rock and roll music, and particularly the most popular band of that or any era, the Beatles. Rock and roll music represents the social turmoil of the 1960s, and the musical climate in the country changed along with the mood and other developments of the decade. And in fact, one could do worse than to track the career of the most popular rock band of that era, the Beatles, when thinking about the social, political, and cultural climate in this country, and in fact around the world, in the 1960s. The Beatles are perhaps the most influential rock and roll band of all time. They were raised in working-class Liverpool, England, during the recovery from World War II. Misery, poverty, and troubles surrounded them. They felt the snubs of the upper classes and developed a rebellious edge. Early in their career, in the shabby clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg, they often wore leather jackets and T-shirts, belying the clean-cut image they presented when they came to the United States. They were already a very popular group in England when in 1964 they hit the United States charts. In January 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number 1 on the pop charts and sold at a rate of 10,000 copies per hour in New York City alone. The next month, they made their debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, drawing a record audience of 73 million viewers in one of the most important moments in rock and roll history. By April, unbelievably, they had all 5 of the top 5 places on the Billboard chart simultaneously. The Beatles had a profound cultural impact, and their timing was perfect. By the mid-1960s, the baby boom generation was looking for something fresh. The assassination of JFK late in 1963 left many disillusioned by the buttoned-down consensus culture advocated by their parents. As one fan declared, "My mother hates them, my father hates them, my teacher hates them. Can you think of 3 better reasons why I love them?" The Beatles also offered a fresh-faced enthusiasm and joy in an increasingly dark time after the death of JFK. The Beatles also represented a new style. They had changed their dress to clean-cut coat and ties, and they brought a festive spirit. While not gyrating in Elvis style, they jiggled, moved, and smiled and laughed on stage, encouraging the audience to enjoy themselves as well. They arrived in the States to Beatlemania, with hordes of crazed young girls lusting after them. This accompanied the increasing sexual revolution, and similar to Elvis, represented a liberation of pent-up feelings in young girls. The Beatles also revolutionized the recording industry. They were among a handful of artists who insisted on writing and performing their own music, after a few successful covers early in their careers. They also insisted on having some control over the engineering of each album. As they said, "We gradually became the workmen who took over the factory." They also tried to resist the constraints of show business, paving their own path. They didn't want to become a package sold to the public in a particular way. After a few early performances, they established a policy of no official functions, ever. Despite their insistence on artistic and personal freedoms, they still began to feel as if they were living in a fishbowl. Few performers have ever endured such public adoration and obsession. They were constantly approached by fans, many asking for simple requests like a touch, a kiss, a photo, or a lock of hair. These endless requests became tedious quickly. The Beatles began making movies, such as A Hard Day's Night in 1964 and Help in 1965 that reflected this theme of demanding fans, and on your screen is a still shot from one of those movies. The movies were both comedic and dark, and showed an unsettling relationship between the band and their fans. In these films, they are constantly on the run from hordes of fans, accompanied by sometimes wild songs and laughter. Exhausted after a U.S. tour in 1965, they returned to England to rejuvenate themselves and find more artistic inspiration. Their new music reflected the influence of Bob Dylan, whom they met in 1964. He introduced them to marijuana. Their new music also became more introspective and reflected the influence of mind-altering drugs. Dylan also offered them a role model of an independent artist who managed to rise above the throngs of adoring fans and still forge a lifestyle of his own making. In turn, the Beatles influenced Dylan, who in this period began to move away from purely acoustic music. On July 25, 1965, Dylan appeared at the Newport, Rhode Island Rock Festival in a colored shirt and played electric versions of Like a Rolling Stone and other songs. It was his first significant performance without an acoustic guitar, and it was transformative of all rock and roll. While many of the fans in the audience were shocked and booed, many more were drawn to this new Dylan, and many other performers took it as a license to move in new directions themselves. And the Beatles, too, were ready to move in new directions. Music was entering one of its most glorious periods. Dylan had gone electric and was inspiring other musicians. In Detroit, the Motown recording studio was churning out some of the greatest songs ever recorded by a host of talented black artists like Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, and Marvin Gaye. In that spirit, the Beatles recorded the album later described by Rolling Stone magazine as the most important rock and roll album ever made, an unsurpassed adventure in concept, sound, songwriting, cover art, and studio technology, rock's greatest declaration of change. This was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album took some 700 hours to make, from late 1966 to April of 1967. It was a concept album, the songs revolving around a unified story and theme. They used multi-tracking to have songs sound as if hundreds of instruments and voices were performing simultaneously. The songs were also full of drug references. McCartney later explained the inspiration for the album. In a word, drugs. Pot. Meanwhile, another British band was having a significant impact on the U.S. rock scene. The Rolling Stones, formed in mid-1963, drew heavily from the American blues. They attempted to present an image in stark contrast to the clean-cut Beatles. They were threatening, uncouth, and animalistic. As one writer remarked, "The Beatles may want to hold your hand. The Stones want to burn your town." Their U.S. tour in fall of 1964 was a smash hit. By the late 1960s, their songs took on a political edge and more suggestive themes, such as Sympathy for the Devil, which the band allowed people to interpret as they wished. By the later 1960s, a new wave of rock performers was raising cultural and political consciousness. The Beatles themselves now wore long hair, mustaches, and love beads. Another British group, The Who, presented an even more threatening hard rock image and sound. And other artists, such as Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison and the Doors, The Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane, embraced the counterculture of the late 1960s. The new rock and roll music found a new home on FM radio. While it was developed in the 1930s, FM didn't become popular until the 1960s, when crowded AM radio bands encouraged newer stations to seek out new frequencies. By 1967, rock and roll stations with adventurous disc jockeys were common on the FM dial. FM disc jockeys played longer tracks, like the 6-minute Hey Jude by the Beatles, and sometimes played whole album sides, or played the same song over and over again to audiences craving it. They often played several commercials in a row and then played uninterrupted music for a half hour or more. In our next lecture, we'll talk about other aspects of music in the 1960s and the clash in culture often represented in this decade, as young fought against old on many fronts, and the new, progressive, liberating lifestyle clashed with an older, conservative thread in American culture.